Hello guys, and now we are on the fifth game in the Blockades and Prophylaxis series. And now this game is a French defense game, and it's an advanced variation in the French. And it's played between Sotsko and Zlatanovic in 2015. And now e4, e6, d4, d5. Knight d2, knight c6, knight g f3, and knight f6, e5, knight d7, knight b3. One of the many moves tested in this position, and bishop to e7. This move is played with the idea to preventing some moves like bishop g5 or knight g5. Now bishop to b5, knight c b8, and black black prevents white's idea of doubling the pawns and prepares the exchange of the light squared bishops. Now castle shot b6, c3, a5, and here bishop a6 immediately is bad. After bishop takes a6 and knight takes a6 and queen to d3, black is forced to retreat, wasting the time. So first a5, then a4, then bishop to x6, and bishop takes a6, and knight takes a6. If at all bishop to f4, bishop to f4, then bishop takes b5, a takes b5, leads to the momentary paralysis of black's queenside troops. Black can break free with the move c6, but then c5 would no longer be an option after the exchange of pawns. Undermining the pawn chain with the advance of the a and b pawns would be too slow. White will have enough time to seize the initiative on the king side. So here after bishop, here if at all white played bishop f4, then c6 is also an option. It's better than taking the bishop on b5, but white took the bishop, and now knight takes a6. Now bishop to e3 and c5. Now rook c1, and this is the first important moment in the game. One idea for white is in this line can be to open the position with the move c4. The weak b5 and c6 squares can cause black some problems. Now c4, black decided to radically eliminate that possibility, but this is risky. By blocking the queen side, he must organize an attack further down the chain on the c3 pawn. This is time consuming. However, black has achieved a lot by exchanging the light squared bishops and eliminating white's threats on the king side by taking away the g5 square. Certainly white must carry out a direct pawn attack on the king side, but black is ready to face it. Now knight to b2, b5, the point of the previous move. Before white plays b3, black unblocks the a5 pawn. Now ab5, knight to c7, knight to e1. White prepares an invasion on the king side. Here if instead b3, then cb3, queen takes b3, and a4, followed by knight to b6 with dangerous compensation for the pawn. So after knight e1, now short castles, now f4, queen to b8. a very fine move. Black wants to recapture on b5 with the queen. The knight will be needed on c7. Black could stop white's attack directly with f5, but he wanted to provoke white's next move. Now g4. This is a logical continuation. Here f5 was an option, but after ef5, then rook takes f5, then queen takes b5. Black is even slightly better. The knight from c7 will head to the perfect blockading square on e6. Now even the rook can go to a6 to support the kingside counterattack with f6. So now after g4, f5, and this move is even stronger with white's pawn on g4. The position on the king side will be opened, and advancing the g pawn will actually weaken white's king side. Now e takes f6 and knight takes f6. Here g5 is very bad, of course, and white blocks the side on which he is determined to attack, giving black freedom to organize queenside play. And if at all g takes f5 is played, then rook takes f5 with the perfect outpost for the black pieces on f5. So e takes f6 was better, and now knight takes f6 and g5. Here instead of g5, h3 looks more solid, not allowing a blockade on the light squares. But it would also be a sign of white's resistance. Now knight f to e8. The knight goes to the ideal d6 square, from where it can jump both to e4 and f5. Now queen g4 and g6. Black played this move to block the g pawn and secure an outpost on f5. White's natural attack on the h file cannot easily be organized. It has become clear that white's attack has been parried, and black's blockade on the weak light squares is in the center will be the decisive positional factor. Now knight d f3, bishop to d6. It is important to control the e5 square and capture the white knight when it gets there. The black knight will travel to f5 via g7. Now knight g2 and knight g7. Now rook c e1. Now queen takes b5, bishop to c1 and a4. Black has recaptured the pawn and is ready to install pieces. The knight initially on the weak central light squares. Advancing the a pawn with the idea to infiltrate on the queen side is also an option. Now queen to h3, knight to f5, knight to e3, and knight takes e3. Here black avoids the clever trap set by white, that is bishop takes f4, knight takes f5, and rook takes f5. Now bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, and rook takes e6, and black's position is in ruins now. Here after knight takes e3, rook takes e3, rook a e8, and here once again the f4 pawn was poisoned, and rook takes f4, there is rook takes e6, and if at all bishop takes f4, then again rook takes e6, And if at all bishop takes, rook takes, if this is taken, then this comes rook f7, knight to e5. Okay, if at all king goes h8, then bishop takes f4 is coming. After rook takes f4, then there is queen e5 double attack. So the f4 pawn is poisoned. So after rook ae8, knight to e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, the situation has simplified. Black is clearly better due to a much better minor piece. Although there are many problems with converting this advantage, white maintains pressure on the e file, which can be transferred to the h file. Black must put a knight on f5 or e4. Black must also try to exchange queens and a pair of rooks. The endgame of rook and knight against rook and bishop would be a dream come true for black. Now rook to f5, rook to e2, queen to d7, bringing the queen back to defend and vacating the b5 square for the knight. Now queen to g4, knight b5, rook f3, queen knight d6, h4, h5. Both sides were in time trouble, so black missed a better continuation, being afraid of the attack on the h file. Actually, black wanted to play on the king side himself after white's en passant. He was worried he would not be able to realize his advantage due to an overblocked position. If white doesn't capture en passant, the king side will be blocked permanently and white's position will collapse on the queen side. And here instead of h5, knight e4 was still a better option. Now h5 by white would be met by the powerful e5. If at all knight to e4, h5, e5, then now rook to g2 is given. If it is taken, now rook takes g5 is coming. So it is a blunder. So now if at all it is taken, then what happens? Then again rook takes g5. Now this cannot be taken. There is a discovered attack on the queen. So that is why the e5 push was very powerful. So but black didn't play knight to e4, he played h5. Now g takes h6, king h7, rook g3, queen to f7. Black's idea is to attack on the h file after rook h5 and knight goes to f5. Now rook eg2, rook g8, and now h5. This is a mistake. White has miscalculated. The g8 rook is protected well enough, or maybe white wanted to create play on the h file after losing both h pawns. But the answer remains a mystery. But this move actually made black's life a lot easier. And the correct move here would have been queen to d1, then rook to h5, all these, rook g4 and knight to f5. So somehow white tried for a counter play, but it was in vain. After rook takes h5, queen d1, queen e8, and queen to e1, intending to double on the e file. Now knight to f5, rook g5, queen f7. The e6 pawn will need protecting. The h6 pawn can be taken at any moment. Now queen to d1, and now queen e8, and queen to e1, and queen f7, queen d1, rook takes h6. After some repetition, black found a good plan to realize the advantage. White's queen is temporarily out of play, and black regroups to organize a dangerous doubling down the h file. Queen takes a4, king h8, queen c2, queen h7, rook h2. Now king g7. Black wants to win a tempo. Here rook to a8 with the same idea was simple and very good. The rook will infiltrate down the a file. But black played king g7. Now queen e2, rook takes h2, queen takes h2, queen takes h2, and king takes h2. The game is over. Such a difference in power between the minor pieces is decisive. It is fairly rare to see such a good knight under such a poor bishop. The conversion is simple. Black's rook penetrates down the h file, and the knight goes to e4, vacating the fi square for the king. Now rook h8 check, king g2, king f6, and king f2, and knight to d6, and rook g1, knight e4 check, king e2, rook h2 check, king e1, king f5. White's pieces are forced to retreat. Meanwhile, black's trio are organizing a mating attack. Now rook f1, here if at all king d1, then knight f2 check, king to e1, knight d3 check, king d1, then king to e4. After rook to f1, now king g4, rook g1 check, king f3, rook f1 check, rook f2, rook g1 is a blunder, and rook e2, now king d1, and there is knight f2 mate. The game was played in the last round. The final position is very beautiful and is the logical result of the end game. The end game is everything black had hoped for when playing his 13th move. A very typical game that explores the total domination of a knight over a bishop. Also an instructive example on the topic of how middle game plans should be based on the arising end game. So thank you all guys. I'll be meeting you in the next game.